Black American culture is in a really weird position because Black Americans are a relatively small portion of the world's population, but somehow our cultural footprint is gigantic. Hip hop is global, R&B is global, basketball culture is global. Our slang gets repeated across the internet. Our hairstyles become trends. Our dances travel across continents. Somehow somebody can grow up to 5,000 miles away from America and somehow know what's standing on business. Like, bro, who taught you this? But I think the more interesting question isn't whether Black American culture is everywhere. We can see that, obviously. The better question is, how did we get here? Because once you actually look at Black American history, you realize that this culture wasn't created in a vacuum. It developed through hundreds of years of people being forced to adapt, move, build communities, and create something new. To understand modern Black American culture, you obviously have to start with slavery. But I'm not finna sit here and give you a 40-minute history lecture. The important part of this video is what slavery did culturally. Enslaved Africans arrived from different regions and ethnic groups with different languages, religions, musical traditions, and customs. Under slavery, families and communities could be separated and people couldn't simply preserve every part of their original societies unchanged. But that doesn't mean African traditions disappeared. They mixed. African musical ideas interacted with European instruments and Christian traditions. Food traditions adapted to ingredients available in America. Language changed. Religious practices changed, storytelling changed, and over generations something new developed. And not simply African culture, not simply European culture, but increasingly distinct African American cultures created in America. Music became incredibly important because when people don't control many of the institutions around them, culture becomes one of the things communities can continue producing for themselves. And then slavery ends. But Black Americans obviously don't immediately enter an integrated America. Instead, especially in the South, you eventually get Jim Crow segregation. Schools separated, business separated, neighborhoods separated, entertainment venues separated, even basic public accommodations could be separated. And obviously, those policies were destructive, but there's an unintended cultural consequence that's important to this story. Black communities developed their own institutions and social worlds: churches, newspapers, businesses, schools, music venues, barbershops, social clubs, neighborhoods, even entertainment circuits. Think about what happens when millions of people are interacting heavily within their own communities. Inside jokes develop, music scenes develop, fashion develops, different ways of speaking develop, local celebrities develop, different cities start creating their own identities. The curtain America pulled around Black communities didn't prevent culture from developing behind it. If anything, it meant that a lot of that culture developed with a strong identity of its own. And then comes one of the most important events in this entire story, the Great Migration. During much of the 20th century, millions of Black Americans left the South and moved to the cities across North, Midwest, and West. Places like Chicago, Detroit, New York, Philly, LA, Oakland. Black America geographically reshuffled itself. And people didn't arrive empty-handed. They brought Southern food, music, religious traditions, stories, accents, family traditions, and those things started mixing with life in major industrial cities. This is where things get interesting because now instead of Black culture being concentrated primarily in the South, you start getting major Black cultural centers throughout the country. Chicago develops its own sound, Detroit develops its own sound, New York develops its own identity, LA develops its own identity. It's almost like America accidentally created different laboratories for Black culture, and each city started cooking something different. But there was another major factor: housing. For much of the 20th century, Black Americans faced discriminatory housing practices. Redlining is probably the term you've heard the most. Federal housing maps and lending practices helped reinforce patterns where many Black neighborhoods were treated as risky investments, while discrimination and restrictive housing practices also limited where Black families could live. That had serious economic consequences. But culturally, it also meant many Black Americans were heavily concentrated in particular neighborhoods, and concentrated communities produce culture extremely efficiently. Think about it. If the musicians live near the dancers, and the dancers know the fashion people, and everybody goes to the same clubs, and their kids attend the same schools, and everybody hangs out in the same few places, ideas bounce around incredibly quickly. And that's how you get neighborhoods and cities becoming associated with entire cultural movements. Harlem becomes Harlem, Detroit becomes Motown, Chicago becomes a center for blues and later house music. The Bronx becomes associated with the birth of hip-hop. Different circumstances, different generations, but the same basic pattern. Community creates culture. And hip-hop might be the easiest example of everything I'm talking about, because early hip-hop wasn't created inside some giant corporate laboratory. It grew out of communities in New York during the 1970s. DJs, MCs, breakdancers, graffiti artists, block parties. Young people were using whatever they had around them. Turntables become instruments, existing records become raw material, a neighborhood party becomes a performance venue, and eventually something that started locally becomes one of the biggest cultural movements on earth. That's the pattern you keep seeing throughout Black American history. Jazz, blues, R&B, rock and roll, hip-hop, house. Different circumstances obviously, but again and again, relatively small communities create something, and America discovers people like it, and then the machine gets involved. And by the machine, I mean American mass media: radio, records, movies, television, advertising, sports broadcasting, and eventually the internet. This is where Black culture goes from the influential inside America to being almost impossible to avoid globally, because America has something very few countries have ever possessed at this scale: an enormous global entertainment industry. So imagine Black communities as the kitchen. They're constantly cooking. Then America builds the biggest delivery service on earth. Not everybody gets a plate. Michael Jackson isn't only performing for Black America, he's performing for the planet. Michael Jordan isn't simply an American basketball player, he's becoming an international icon, or he's always been. Hip-hop doesn't remain in New York. it gets exported everywhere, and eventually other countries start creating their own versions. British rap, French rap, Japanese hip-hop, Korean hip-hop, African hip-hop scenes. At that point, the culture just isn't just being exported anymore. It's reproducing itself. And social media basically put this process on steroids. Because before the internet, you needed somebody to distribute culture, a record label, a television network, a magazine, a radio station. Now, all you need is Wi-Fi. That's it. A teen in Atlanta can create a dance in his bedroom tonight, and somebody in Germany can be doing it tomorrow. A phrase gets popular on Black Twitter, then it reaches TikTok, and the streamer starts saying it, then everybody starts saying it, and then your 47-year-old manager starts saying it in a fucking Zoom meeting. And now we have to retire the phrase. That's just the life cycle. And I think history actually gives us the answer. Black Americans spent centuries developing a distinct culture inside the United States. Slavery forced different traditions to adapt and combine. Segregation helped produce tightly connected institutions and communities. The Great Migration moved those communities into major cities throughout the country. Housing patterns often concentrated them even further. Those cities developed distinct music, fashion, language, and entertainment scenes. Then American mass media took those creations nationwide, and eventually the internet took them worldwide. None of this means every Black American acts the same. Obviously, we don't. Somebody from New Orleans can have a completely different cultural experience from somebody in Detroit. That's actually part of what makes the story interesting. There isn't one single Black American culture. There are regional cultures constantly influencing each other. And that's how we ended up here. Black American culture didn't suddenly become influential because the internet decided Black people were cool one morning. There are centuries behind this. Communities were created. Communities were separated. People migrated. Cities changed. Music evolved. New cultures formed. America built enormous entertainment industries, and eventually those industries started broadcasting pieces of Black America across the entire planet. Then social media removed whatever borders are left. So now you can be sitting in Atlanta on your phone and then watch somebody on the opposite side of Earth participating in something that traces history back to a community in America, which is actually kind of insane and has its downsides. But Black American culture didn't just become popular. History accidentally built it on one of the largest stages in the world.